Hello, welcome to Books and Brews,
the place where beer and literature meet.
With your host, certified Cicerone Michael Agnew.
And Laura Mosica, author of the Bluebells Chronicles.
Each month we invite a guest author to read their words and talk about writing while sipping beers specially paired with their work.
This month we talk Indian treaties with Martin Case.
So sit back,
pop a cold one,
and dive into some books
and brews. It is exactly what will come out. Are we ready? All right, we are ready to go. Let's do this thing. Hello, Laura.
Welcome back. It's 2020.
It's 2020.
This is officially the December program, 2019, but it is 2020.
Yes.
So there's a certain irony.
Well, it's the January program,
right?
Because what we record in December usually gets put up in January.
That's true.
We're just doing it very late in January.
Out of order. How's your month been?
It's been really good.
Yeah.
The best thing. You might be interested in this because you're a musician. I got a banjo for Christmas.
Oh, you did.
And so I am learning.
You were talking about that.
Teaching myself to play the banjo.
Yeah.
That sounds terrible.
Very exciting.
Be gone. I can't believe he said that in the presence of a musician.
Well, no.
Did you invite this guy?
I think it's true. By the way, the voice you're hearing is our guest, Marty Case, my friend Martin Case. But there is...
You've never been in the presence of someone learning to play a clarinet?
Well, that's true. That would be really annoying, too.
That can be unpleasant.
But I think there might be, the thought of banjo played by somebody who has no idea how to play it is...
How bad can it be?
Because a lot of people hate the banjo, even when it's played by people who know how to play it.
Well, I did learn a couple of chords in Hawaii. There was this really cool place where you could walk in and they'd give you a banjo lesson for free.
Right.
So yeah.
I'm getting the right hand picking down.
Very cool.
That I can do pretty well.
Okay.
The problem I'm having is figuring out how to do the chords with the left hand, and I regularly land on the wrong string and the wrong fret.
Practice.
Yep.
Well, yeah, I had all my student recitals, so I teach at multiple places, so I had lots and lots of recitals, lots of music. My student with his purple harp played for the first time, and I had a student with a purple clarinet, and I wish he'd come back for lessons so I could get the purple instruments together, because, what else matters in music. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we had, I had all 9 kids home for Christmas. They came from Hawaii, from Tennessee, from Iowa, and we were able to do our family pyramid again, which we do every year.
Oh, I saw pictures of that on Facebook.
Yeah.
You make a human pyramid?
We make a human pyramid. And
she has 9 kids.
Yeah, that's a large pyramid.
Well, it's only 9, so we usually have to get somebody else involved to get the 10 people. And this year we had 11 my daughter-in-law was 7 months pregnant, so we allowed her not to be in it. So, since you didn't see the picture, she stood there with the sign saying, "Bad idea," pointing to the pyramid.
Do you find as the years go by that you rise in the pyramid?
That's exactly what happened, because when we started, my youngest was about 5, and as he got bigger, his head was scraping the ceiling. So we took it outside, and hence why it's in snow. So, yeah, but it's been a good month, and we're now into January. I'm going to my son's wrestling matches and all kinds of fun stuff.
What you been reading?
Oh my goodness! Well, I've been reading this book called The Relentless Business of Treaties. I've been trying to...
It's a great book, by the way.
It takes a while to get through.
A pure coincidence that we have the author here. Actually, I thought to sort of tie into what I'm reading, I've been doing lots of heavy reading. The past few months I've been reading children's books. Now I'm going to theology, total difference. But I thought it was kind of interesting. Do you want to tell our guests about where we are? And by guests, I mean we're up to 3.2 million listeners now.
We want to thank the Yoerg Brewery for letting us record on site for the first time ever. This is a live, remote recording, not just at my dining room table. So that's the Yoerg Brewery at 378 Maria Avenue in St. Paul. Minnesota.
Well, I thought what was really interesting about this is this brewery goes back to, 1848?
Which is why we're here, because I wanted to pour
It
one of
ties
their
into
beers
the-
to tie in with
the history.
Marty's readings.
The history, but they are also, what did he say, one of the only Trappist pub
Yeah.
that serves Trappist beer. And so they have 14 ales from 7 different monasteries in 4 countries. And so I've been
And
reading...
if you're a fan of Belgian beers, they've got all the Belgian beers that you can't find in stores anymore.
Which is why we're here. Some beers. So anyway, my theological reading this month just sort of ties in to being in a place serving Trappist beer. I've been reading about the Beatitudes, and how these ideas
And that ties
affect
into
how we
one of
live.
Marty's readings as well.
Yeah, it does. So everything just ties
great.
together. And so
This is like a cohesive episode.
it's holistic or something, yeah. So anyway, who we have here today...
I got to tell you what I've been reading.
Oh, what have you? I'm sorry. Oh, if only you could see the look on his face. I
So
will never make that
I've read a
mistake
couple of
again.
things. First, I read Tales of Hoffman, which I have.
Tales of Hoffman.
Tales of Hoffman, E.T.A. Hoffman. He was a German writer in the 18th century. Wrote just kind of fantastical stories, kind of ahead of their time, maybe. Like one. So if anyone is familiar with the opera Tales of Hoffman,
That's what I was
Offenbach,
thinking
it's those are based on
Interesting.
the E.T.A. Hoffman
I
stories.
always learn interesting things from
So,
you.
like the story of Olympia, where the guy becomes enamored of an automaton that everybody knows is an automaton except for him.
That's interesting. I watched a movie that I almost wonder if the author of that movie is familiar with that story.
Could be,
I
but
tell you
it's
what the movie is, but I don't remember.
so it's stories like that. They're kind of fantastical in a way, ahead of their time, a little bit odd, a little bit bizarre. And then I just also read James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, which is an awesome book about the black experience, and particularly in the 1960s and leading up to it. There's a quote from it, which I printed out and I forgot to bring,
In
that
the
I
whole
wanted to bring up
country, specific
in
region.
connection with Marty's readings. In this country,
Okay.
and I recommend it. I mean, James Baldwin is phenomenal anyway. And if you see old video of him speaking, it's...
Right.
So that's what I've been reading.
Okay, so you have not been doing light reading either.
No.
Heavy stuff.
Although I'd say Tales of Hoffman is pretty light reading.
Okay, well, that does sound interesting, and I still have Baron in the Trees on my list. It's on my computer, waiting to be read.
Oh, great. Yeah, you should read it.
You talked about that months ago. So we have here with us today Martin Case. He is a freelance researcher and writer. He researches political and economic networks that shaped U.S. relationships with indigenous nations and drove the expansion of the U.S. across the continent. He was on the design team for Why Treaties Matter, a collaboration of the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, the Minnesota Humanities Center, and the Smithsonian Institute. His book, The Relentless Business of Treaties, How Indigenous Land Became U.S. Property, was published in 2019 by the Minnesota Historical Society Press. And is that accurate, 2019?
It's 2018.
2018, I thought that's what
Yeah.
you said. So I took this off, I think, your website.
I might have just emailed you this little thing, made up
Okay.
this thing on the spot.
Okay,
Typo.
that's okay. We wouldn't want to be off on the air. So what is our first beer?
Let me make sure you're reading your order of readings there. So what are you reading first?
I think first I'm going to talk about what I think is the most significant thing about treaties and the transition they make and how people relate to the natural world.
Okay, so that's the one that I need the Yoerg beer for.
And then we'll get into the Doctrine of Discovery in that.
Great, that'll be the second reading.
No.
No.
Those are both in the first. It goes right in from that into the Marshall Doctrine of Discovery. The second
those
one's
are-
kind of about myth making.
Got it, okay. Great, okay. Then
This
I've
is
got
what
the
I
right beer.
have for your first reading. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great. So the first beer then is Samuel Smith India Ale. English-style India Pale Ale from England. The reason I went with this beer, the idea behind the pairing, is that a lot of what you're writing about in this book, basically you're talking about colonization.
Right.
In really the worst academic sense of colonization. The kind of idea of one culture completely taking over another. And you don't get more colonization than India Pale Ale, than the East India Company in India.
It kind of started it all.
Yeah, kind of started it all. And this India Pale Ale was developed in India during those days of colonization in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, as the refreshing beer for the expats who were controlling India. So this is India style, or English style India Pale Ale. A little bit maltier, less bitter than American style.
Those English colonialists knew how to brew a beer, huh?
Yes, they did.
I think you can guess where I stand on this
You
one,
don't
right?
like this one, I know. You're not a
You
fan of
saw
the
that
hops.
coming.
You're not a fan of the hops.
I am finding I like the darker beers. So, go ahead with your reading.
Okay. Well, the
Is this a series of shorter quotations, correct?
right.
Okay.
Various links. The main point I want to get to, and this is mostly from the introduction to the book, is that unlike India, where British colonialism set up shop to extract resources, basically, the enterprise of colonialists in North America was to acquire the land. And so the point I want to start out with is that people have relationships to the natural world, and what treaty making was trying to eliminate one relationship and supplant it with another relationship. So I'm going to start out trying to get to that point. Individuals have a great capacity for complex relationships with the natural world. The landscape is our home, and home life is always complicated. It provides sustenance, inspiration, and entertainment, shapes our transportation and commerce. But from these many possibilities, societies are structured on specific relationships with the natural world. And those selected relationships make a society distinctive. So I want to make the point that individuals have really complex relationships to the landscape, but American society, Dakota societies, they're built on one relationship, as I'm going to get into now. If, for example, societies are organized on the principle of kinship with elements of the natural world, as are traditional Dakota and Ojibwa societies, that organizing principle will be reflected in a family structure where rivers are relatives, and shape the traditional political structures, cultural infrastructure, commerce, and international diplomacy of those societies. I've heard treaty making among indigenous societies described as making relatives, which is very different than the U.S. approach to diplomacy. The organizing principle, in this case kinship, defines moral behavior and determines which communally made decisions are politically acceptable. The United States, too, is also based on a relationship between people in the natural world, a property relationship. The westward growth of the U.S., the business of territory making, was essentially the expansion of a system of property. In the rhetoric of the American myth, land cession treaties are often presented as real estate transactions, exchanges between landowners. The idea of land ownership is so deeply seated in American society that at times it can be difficult to imagine land as anything other than real estate. But rather than being property sales, the treaties were in effect moments when the natural world became private property in the U.S. And that took me a while to get to. The idea that land was not always property. And to start to comprehend how different society would be if the natural world wasn't property.
Right. Now, so you're saying it took you a while to get to that idea via your research.
Yeah, and just my experience in learning about this and thinking about it and discussing it.
And that brings me to the question, which was probably way elsewhere in the interview, but that's okay. I have 9 kids. I do well flying by the seat of my pants. Have to. What sort of research did you do that brought you to this idea that somebody else sees land is completely different than we might?
Yeah, it was kind of a roundabout route. I first started looking at treaties and the men who signed them for the U.S. After running across this Dakota Treaty from 1837 and noticed it was signed by a guy named Joel Poinsett. And dug into him a bit and realized he was the guy who was the ambassador to Mexico and found a flower there, brought it to the U.S. and named it after himself, the poinsettia. And that kind of became the metaphor for all treaty making. White people, essentially, finding indigenous resources, changing the name, changing the context, putting their own story on top of that story.
And how did you, what resources told you how the indigenous people viewed land? Did you read documents? Was it written in the treaties? Did you speak to people?
It is written in the treaties.
Okay.
You can read the negotiations of a lot of these because there were notes taken at the time. I learned a lot in working on that Why Treaties Matter exhibit, which was essentially a lot of Dakota and Ojibwa people.
That was at the Minnesota History Center?
That was at the Minnesota Humanities Center.
Humanities Center.
Right. And then my wife is Dakota, I just...
Okay, I didn't know.
I don't present anything from an indigenous perspective, I'm not the person to ask about what that other relationship is. I'm completely steeped in the property system. I just gotten far enough to see that there's a limit to how true and real property is as a relationship to the natural world. There are other alternatives out there.
Can we back up a little bit? And before digging into this, can you tell us more about your background as how you got involved in this? What were you doing before you started researching this? Because I think this project started, 4 or 5 years ago?
Like 13 years ago.
13.
Yeah.
Oh,
Right.
This is a very long term.
Yeah.
I've known Marty for a long time, and I've been hearing about treaty signers for at least 10 years.
Right. There have been times when I think people have gotten sick of hearing about treaties from me because I can bend any subject to the subject of treaty
That's
signers.
kind of like me and Robert the Brews. Have I told you about it? Oh, I'm sorry, no, that's not what we're talking about. So what were you doing before that? What was your degree in? What was your career field?
I have a degree in literature.
Okay.
I'd spent 10 years as director of development for a community arts organization. Did writing, mostly nonfiction and poetry.
Okay.
And then kind of...
So you were writing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So I came to this as a writer and storyteller. And then because the subject is history, I had to get into footnoting and stuff, which is just a killer of creativity. But just kind of tumbled into, first, the fact that so many people who represented the U.S. at these treaties were related to one another. I was fascinated by that. That kind of surprised me.
No, I was interested in that because I had sort of this, it was like shifting a prism, and it keeps looking one way and then another, because on the one hand I thought that is very interesting, and then I thought, and yet isn't it always like that? Because you go to the people you go to family members, so I was curious, if you looked into the indigenous centers, would you find the same thing?
Well, sure, because their society was based on kinship.
Right.
What interested me was that, especially these family relationships, but also the business relationships among the U.S. signers, flies in the face of the American myth. I was taught when I was a kid that there's no class structure in the U.S. I mean, it's hard to believe today.
Can you believe that?
But, right. I did. Back in the 60s, you were taught that. And particularly, I had the impression, even as a grown-up person, that the hero of Western expansion was the pioneer.
Have you had our Bock before?
This, the American myth is that the whole thing went down so somebody could get a farm and pick rocks and cut down the trees and grow food. It took me a long time to come to the realization that really what was happening was people were acquiring vast tracts of land, and the pioneer was their customer. And so all these relationships are kind of how the money flowed, and it was not egalitarian. It was totally
I look
class-based.
at the world today, and I think it's not as egalitarian as I might have thought.
Right.
But,
right.
you know, I think it does come back to family relationships and who you know, and the older I get, the more I realize it really is who you know.
That's right. And this was really intentional, who you know. The money and the land and the fur trade and the mining, the resource extraction, that's going to flow along family lines. Some people in the families are going to be treaty signers, some are going to be politicians, some, you know, it's a very tight-knit group for the 2,300 guys who signed treaties for the U.S.
Right.
Surprisingly
I
tight-knit.
was thinking as I read it, it's very similar today. You know, when you start looking at all the connections, even today, between politicians, celebrities,
Right.
there are a lot of connections even now. So I was thinking, well, really nothing's changed. This
And
is
in-
the way it's always been.
And in fact, treaties are where it started. It's how...
You don't think that medieval Europe, it had something to do with who you knew?
Oh, it had something to do with
I think
who you
it's
knew.
always been that
But
way.
we have a story in the U.S. that it was not that
So
way.
your point is not really that this is anything unique, but that it's a little different from the
It's
view that's
diametrically
given.
opposed
Right.
to the
What
American
we've been
myth.
Right.
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 So for just to, at this
Yeah.
moment, I seem to recall like the Shoto family, which
Right.
I grew up in St. Louis, and Shoto is like well known to anyone in St. Louis.
Right.
I seem to recall that the Shoto family, they're like a whole bunch of Shotos who...
Yeah. That's how I actually really got into this. I think I'm the first person who ever downloaded all the names of everyone who ever signed a treaty for the U.S. and I could sort them by name. And there were 54 signatures by guys named Shoto, and I'd never heard of them.
Can you spell that?
Shouteau,
Okay.
French name.
So people can. Oh yes, I was pronouncing that totally wrong as I read it. In the I was
Shoto,
thinking that-
Shoto. Yeah, right.
If you're from St. Louis, it's Shoto.
Right, right.
and being from a very German place,
Yeah.
you know, I'm hearing that name differently when
Right.
I'm reading it.
Right.
That is a fascinating website. And how many of you said there are 2,300 signers? How many are on the website? Is it all
I have
2,300?
that's what the research was for all those years,
Okay.
was building their biographies and telling stories about the connections among them. So I have about 1,700
Okay.
little biographical
So
entries.
it's an ongoing project to get
Yeah,
all 2,300 up. I took a glance at it last night and I thought, wow, I would almost write historical fiction set in this era just because you've done all the research for me. I mean,
There you go. There's your next series.
And there are
well,
wild
you know,
stories in
I'm kind
there.
of stuck in medieval Scotland, but you might encourage me to branch
Oh,
out.
there are some really wild
I
stories
bet
in
there
there.
are. Well, and that's what I love about fiction is truth is
Yeah,
wilder
absolutely.
than fiction. You can't make up this stuff.
Right.
So I hope one day to have the time to just sit down and read story after
Right.
story. So to our 3.5 million listeners, you notice it just went up in the 20 minutes we've been talking.
Since we're talking about your website, can you give us where do people
The
find
address, yeah. I would like people to go find that.
Yeah, treatiesigners.org. We're just adding a new portal on that this week. You can, through that address, treatiesigners.org, you can get to all this information on U.S. signers. We're just putting up a list of 10,500 Indigenous signers.
Wonderful. And that's what I wanted to ask about, too, if you were
Right.
going to tell their stories also.
No, because
No,
I'm not the guy
okay.
to do it. And
Okay.
also, it'd be
you
like
think somebody
saying, since it'll have to be a lot of people. It's like saying, since you did the history of French signers, why don't you do all the signers in Europe? These are like 20 to 40 different nations, each with their own political structure, each with their own language. One guy is not going to...
It's a lifetime work at the
Right.
very least.
Well, it's also, you've told me that since it was the white signers, like putting down the names, writing
Right.
down the names, that a lot of the indigenous signers are recorded under different names, so you have
Right.
to figure out even who's who.
That's right. And their names are translated differently, and that's a huge research project. But the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, which has sponsored building this website, they're interested over the long term in, I think, using those signatures as a window into political structures of all these different nations. So that's just one fascinating story after another.
So I think we need to move on to beer number 2.
Okay.
Oh,
And I'm going to grab Tom right quick for this beer. So talk among yourselves.
All right.
Did you have more to read on reading number 1?
I would like to end that by just talking about the Doctrine of Discovery,
Go ahead. Yeah.
because this is why the treaties are important, not just to indigenous people, but to the U.S.
Okay.
All
so-
land titles in the U.S. are based on treaties, and this is how it worked. They had to figure out what makes one land title better than another. So John Marshall, in a Supreme Court case, Johnson v. McIntosh, came up with the Doctrine of Discovery.
Don't read yet.
No? Okay. I'm not going to read yet.
I got to introduce this beer. It's
yeah.
paired to your reading.
This is the end of the first reading.
Oh, this is the end of the first reading.
Right. I'm just going to blast through part of this.
Okay,
And
got
then
it.
we'll move on. I know we're got time constraints.
I'm
here.
confused.
Well, while you were
See, that's
dealing
because
with
you're
Tom,
sitting on the wrong
Yeah,
side.
that's right.
You messed with our order.
I just want to mention this Doctrine of Discovery because it's so critical to understanding treaties. So Marshall basically said the title to your house is based on two things: the right of dominion and the right of occupancy. It's part of a property system, and you can actually live there. And Marshall wanted to claim that the right of dominion was created when a territory was discovered by a colonial power. He said, discovery gave title to the government by whose subjects or by whose authority it was made. It was a right with which no Europeans could interfere. It was a right which all asserted for themselves. The point of the Doctrine of Discovery lay in the relationship between right of dominion and right of occupancy. And the point here is that, like, I was taught when I was a kid that the U.S. bought the Midwest from France in the Louisiana Purchase. It didn't. It just bought the right of dominion. Still had to make treaties with indigenous groups. Okay, and I won't read the whole thing, but the point is that in the U.S., indigenous nations could only cede their land to the U.S. government, and then the government could hand it out or sell it. And that was the point of, that was going to fund the government, acquiring indigenous land and selling it. And so treaties were the way the property titles were created. It wasn't property until it was ceded to the U.S. And only Europeans could get the right to dominion.
Okay, so nobody else could. The
Indians, for instance,
Indians
indigenous
could or
people
could
could not have dominion
Okay.
over their own land because they were here when Europeans arrived. It's kind of a weird thing. I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Beer number 2.
Okay, beer number 2. This is from Yoerg Brewing, our host for the day. And again, thank you. I've got Tom Kine here
Welcome.
from Yoerg. He's going to tell us a little bit about this beer, and then I will tell you my thinking behind the pairing. So, tell us about this Bock.
Well, Yoerg was the first brewery in the state of Minnesota to produce a Bock. And along with the flagship beer that we do, we wanted these two to be as close to the original recipes as possible. So we did some research and found out that they bought all their barley from some northern Minnesota farmers. And then used all Washington hops, which before 1900 was pretty rare. I mean, most hops came out of New York and California. So, and our steam beer is a pretty big, robust lager. So we wanted to make our Bock a little bit richer than our steam beer. So we kind of went to after a style I saw on the West Coast that Anchor Steam used to do many years ago, a big black dark Bock. And when we called them and said, how did you get their Bock so dark? They said that they blackened some of the malts. So we actually take about 20% of the Minnesota barley and blacken it. And that's how we make this. So it's pretty roasty, toasty Bock, and 6.5 alcohol, about 30 IBUs. And we're really proud of it.
All right. Thank you. So my thinking behind the pairing here is Yoerg was not just the maker of the first Bock. Yoerg was the first brewery in Minnesota, opened in 1848, so even before statehood. And I was trying to use your book to do some research into the treaties that seeded this area. Is it before the area was even seeded?
St. Paul, east of the river,
St.
was
Paul,
seeded in 37.
Oh, okay.
West of the river, 51.
Got it. So I was looking at the 51.
Yeah.
So,
So St. Paul here was
Yeah.
seeded in before the brewery started.
Got it.
And the brewery was actually in the Seven Corners area of St. Paul, right where on the corner of 7th Street and Kellogg.
Yeah.
So, and they didn't move till 1870 across to the west side.
So this being
Interesting.
one of the first businesses, one of the first white businesses in the area, I thought it appropriate to pick a beer from Yoerg, and this is a beer very similar to the kind of beer that German brewers were making at the time. So we're drinking history.
Excellent.
Cheers.
Yes.
And you're going to like this one more.
Yes, it's dark. I've already tasted it. I jumped the gun.
All right, Marty, go ahead.
I do like it.
Well, as you can probably pick up, what I'm interested in is the American myth and how treaties challenge it. And another slow realization for me was the idea that these guys who signed treaties did not just participate in events that made history. They then made the history of the events they participated in. So this is...
Explain what you mean by that.
I mean, they made the history.
Right.
It was our history is their point of view.
Okay.
So they created the story.
Yes, they told the story. And I want to start with months after this brewery was founded. Where's my read? Here we go. On October 30th, 1849, the Minnesota Territorial Legislature passed an act to incorporate the Historical Society of Minnesota. The bill said, the object of said society shall be the collection and preservation of a library, mineralogical and geological specimens, Indian curiosities, and other matters and things connected with and calculated to illustrate the history and settlement of said territory. So I go on in the book to say, the history of the territory did not amount to much at that point, having started less than 8 months earlier, about the time this brewery was started. So they're already writing the history of the territory 8 months into it. But the incorporation of this society is one of the clearest statements of how Americans would come to delineate the past. Indigenous identity as curiosities, settlement as history. And in fact, guys who signed treaties started the historical societies of New York, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, Montana. And when I say that our history was written by these people, they are the ones who established the institutions by which we learn about the past. They're much better at it now, but they were set up to bury indigenous identity under settler identity.
And was it the same in all these states that they were setting up historical societies almost before the state even existed?
In Michigan, it was long before the state existed.
Okay.
As you go west, the states are formed later. So the machinery was set up.
Okay, and ready to go.
Right. New York was founded in the 1600s. Their historical society wasn't until the 1840s or something. But as soon as the land became property, the treaty signers started telling the story about it. which is why the last thing that happens before American history starts is a treaty. When you read about the history of, say, Minnesota or St. Paul, it always starts out, indigenous people were here, then someone showed up in a boat or wagon, and history started.
Mm-hmm.
This is the whole idea of like the agrarian settler, like
right,
the farmers moving
right,
west in covered wagons. And
right. And how frigging racist is it, when you think about it, to start delineating the first white child born in a place? That is a strange thing to document. Like, that's when our history began, when the first white kid was born. And it's in every history of every place in America. Except Chicago, where the first white kid born was African American. But
How did that work?
fur trade,
That's a DNA miracle.
Right.
Blues went way back.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Although I'm going to say, maybe it's because I grew up in the Air Force, but I've done a lot of traveling, spent a lot of time in the Smithsonian. My parents used to take us there every single Sunday for 3 years straight. Not that I'm bitter. But I will say that, I did grow up hearing quite a bit about the history of the Indians as well.
How much did religion play into something like this?
It was pretty...
Kind of like what the Spanish did in South America and Mexico.
Right, and in here, yeah, very much. Missionaries signed about, I want to say, almost half of all the U.S. Indian treaties. They were big, but the point is, who's telling the story of indigenous people? Traditionally, you can go to museums and learn about indigenous people. In those situations, you're almost never learning from indigenous people. That's a really crucial distinction. Who's controlling the story? It fills this ecological niche to know about indigenous people, but the idea that their relationship to the land is not property, that's a late comer to museum life.
Right. My point, though, is it is being told, at least in my experience. I didn't grow up thinking history started on this day. I grew up knowing that there's quite a bit more. So I did want to ask, and we didn't get to it because the clock keeps going, explain this idea of how the land was viewed. You speak of it as being a kinship, a perspective of kinship. Are you saying they literally viewed rivers, mountains, hills as their kin, their relatives?
Right. I'm reluctant to explain indigenous relationships, but it's almost impossible, I think, to hear a phrase like the river's part of the family if you're coming from a property relationship and think anything other than, well, that sounds very woo-woo, that's very tree-huggy, If your family structure is actually based on kinship, starting with the natural world, it affects everything in your society. So, for instance, I think a lot of indigenous nations, rather than assimilate into a property system, resisted that, and because it made no sense in a kinship. Just as the U.S. is going to ride the private property pony right off the cliff of climate change, because there's no way to address that in a private property system. So this organizing principle based on how you relate to the natural world determines what makes sense politically. If you're, for instance, and I'm not going to identify this with any indigenous society, but if, for instance, you are related family-wise to elements of the natural world, there's certain things you're not going to do.
Right.
Whereas if it's the point of property is to make money from it, there's certain things you're going to do no matter what.
And I think that's a very good way of putting it, that people should be able to understand. It really explains it well. What was I going to ask? It had to do with that. Oh, what I wanted to ask was, given that there were so many different Indian nations and cultures, did every single one of them see it the same way? Did any of them have more of a concept of land ownership?
There was so many different forms of land tenure, you know, how you live on the land. In some societies, as I understand it, you could inherit land, the same plot of land. In some cases, it was assigned communally to certain families. Some places, it was just shared communally. But the point is, society wasn't based on property. All right, so that's what was distinctive from the U.S. system. In the U.S. system, it isn't who owns what, it's that everything is owned by somebody. You cannot look at an object in the U.S. Well, even, you know, you find a pen laying on a desk, and the first question is, hey, does this pen belong to somebody? You know, whose pen is this? You got to nail down who owns the friggin' pen. And if nobody claims it, we're going to throw it away, because that's what we do with things that aren't owned.
I would take the pen.
Right.
And if it was a $100 bill and no one claimed it, you better believe I would not throw it out.
Right. Somebody's got to claim everything, though.
Right.
I think something that you intimated at that's not necessarily tied to this idea of ownership, but that I think is important for people to realize, because it's something that when you first put this idea in front of me, it was mind-blowing. And that is the idea that treaties are international agreements. I think that's an important thing to get across.
It's the key to understanding U.S.-Indian relations, right?
Elaborate.
Well, part of the colonialist enterprise in India, in Africa, in the Western Hemisphere is related to race formation, which is, I mean, the people who started the theory of property had to maintain that property is a universal right. And yet they were going to take land from indigenous people all over the world. So they had to develop race, which meant that some people's human rights were less than white people's. Okay? So there's this drive in the U.S. to see indigenous identity as racial. Indians are a race. Which is why some people think you can determine if you're Indian with a DNA sample, which is not true. Indigenous identity is a national identity, like French or Spanish. It's a social national identity. So these treaties, a lot of Americans want to see them as interracial agreements, white people and Indians, but really they're international agreements. And it wasn't...
So you're saying that we should be calling them agreements between nations.
Well, they are, whether we call them that or not.
But you're
they
saying that people should see it that way.
Right. There is no way to understand treaties without that acknowledgement. And, you know, a lot of people come to U.S. Indian treaties when indigenous people assert their rights, like hunting and fishing. And the typical kind of white response is, why do they have rights that I don't have? In fact, in this international agreement, members of their nation never gave up that right. They don't have a special right. They don't need rights. They have sovereignty, national sovereignty over the national. It's the only way to understand treaty rights, for instance. Anyway.
We need to go on to beer number 3, which is a shame because I have like 58 more questions.
We got some time after beer number 3 for questions,
Okay.
but we're going to shift gears entirely. So if you want to just introduce where we're headed as opposed to where we've been, and then I will introduce the beer and you can do the reading. So
you want me to introduce it?
You're going to introduce it. You wrote it.
So we're moving away from treaties.
This is a completely different.
Marty not only writes and researches about treaties. Marty is a great storyteller. Besides, I've heard endless stories from Marty, and they're always entertaining. And he's interested in a lot of different literary forms and whatnot. And he writes poetry. He writes plays. He writes all kinds of
I
stuff.
didn't know you wrote plays.
And so
I
we're
don't
we're
think I
moving
came across
into the other realm of Marty's
Yeah.
writing, kind of away from the historical treaty research. And with that, I think I can go ahead and introduce the next beer.
So you introduced his work.
I did. Okay, I just leapt in.
Absolutely
Somebody had to
none
do
of
it.
that
It
went
had to
according
be
to
done.
plan.
So the beer to go with this. Can you just give me the title of this?
Gospel of the Child Rabbit.
All right. The beer to go with this is Alpha State from Schell's Brewing Company in New Ulm. This is one of their beers from their sour beer series, which is the best sour program in the state, hands down. This is a Berliner Weiss aged on cherries. I chose this beer for a number of reasons. I will say that I thought the treaty stuff was going to be hard to pair to. This piece was the one that was hard to pair to.
I bet.
So I went with this first, the cherry thing, because there's a reference to cherry blossoms in the piece. But also, this is like a story of the development of Marty, essentially. And these beers, these sour beers, they sit in a tank for a couple of years and develop, because it's a mixed fermentation. A lot of different bacteria and yeast and wild yeast go into creating the beer and making it what it is. And so they sit in this tank and they slowly develop, and they go through periods where they taste good and then taste bad. But it's the combination of all of these different fermentation agents coming together that in the end creates the delicious thing that is in the glass.
All right.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Okay. You've said sour before, and I've liked it.
You're going to love this one.
Okay.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's good.
I do
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
No,
I
any
almost
of these
wouldn't
any of
think
these
that
Schell
was
sour
spirit.
beers are.
I meant to mention just, I wanted to bring my son's beer. He started brewing,
Oh wow!
so I tasted it
Next
for the
time.
first time Sunday. Well, it's
2
gonna be
weeks
gone.
from now, or a week from now.
It's the bottle's open. It's probably not going to be good in 2 weeks. But go ahead.
Well, this is quite different than the Treaties book.
Very different.
Years ago, I was thinking about Gospels as a literary form. They're actually a kind of biography from the ancient world. And there were a lot of biographies written, and back then, biography was to tell you a moral lesson from somebody's life. So the Gospel is a subset of that, biographies about Jesus. And I thought, well, why doesn't anyone use this literary form anymore? And I thought, well, hell, I'm going to write a gospel. And I wasn't going to write one about Jesus. That'd be a little presumptuous, and I never met the guy. So I decided to write one about myself. And it was really an interesting exercise. I learned about the literary form. And the great thing about writing a gospel is you don't have to question where to start, because gospels start in the beginning.
Okay, that makes
It just works great. So maybe I'll just read the first page here, and if
Read as
give me
much as you want.
All right. What I've done is, this is actually, the whole thing's about 8 pages long, and I pulled out 3 little sections, one from the beginning, one from the middle, and then the end.
They all read pretty quick.
All right. I'm going to blast through them then. So this is chapter 1 of Gospel of the Child Rabbit. In the beginning, helicopters flew beyond the vacant lot, dropping parachutes like seeds. In the beginning, grasshoppers oozed juice from mechanical jaws and rubbed their filament legs together. Sprung like a trap, they buzzed into the distance on wooden wings. In the beginning, outside the grandmother's house, broken sidewalk buckled. In the beginning, outside the uncle's house, cattle tracks pooled in the mud beside a creek that carried leaves that were summer memories from a past life. In the beginning, the boy who would become a man, who would become a rabbit, pope of his own rabbit religion, tucked his small body into the giant rut of a tractor tire, safe in the tall weeds that surrounded him. And he sat under a tree, contemplating the blue behind bright green leaves, colors in conflict, but essentially so close. Later, the rabbit, son of Red, the son of Oscar, vicar on earth of Thomas the Twin, child of Mary, born in sin, stood beside the melting asphalt road and watched the distant school bus shimmer out of the surface of the superheated hills. In love with the amputation of the father and the deafness of the mother, he lived in tents made of blankets and chairs on floor-scrubbing days, thrilled to the single yellow, dusty butterfly beyond the apricot appliances, and slept to the vacuum's steady hum. Yet even at the pinnacle of childhood, a wolf without a face appeared at the door. So to me, that's just like how you remember childhood.
Okay, so you said a gospel is a biography. So what distinguishes a gospel from a biography? What would be the difference?
The time it's written.
The time it's written. Okay.
Biographies today are about individuals. Biographies back then were about ideas and moral lessons.
Okay.
There's just
so
biography
that would be
changed.
The difference.
Right.
The concept of a biography is simply different.
If
It
you
really
read,
ties back into that myth-making idea.
it is entirely myth-making. And I will also say that I think the Gospels are a very unreliable literary form.
Right, especially if you're telling your own story, we're the unreliable narrator. What did you gain from writing your life as a parable? Or as a gospel, I should say.
Well, I learned a bit about the literary form, and also it became kind of a meditation on memory more than biography. You know, how are things remembered? How do you remember your childhood?
Right.
And that's kind of what interested me in it. It's memory that's unreliable.
And I think
not
it's a
necessarily the
fascinating
gospel.
question, especially as my kids tell me their memories
Right.
from childhood.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
I always come out looking very good. I'll just say that.
Right. I had my siblings, a couple of my siblings read this, and my sister said, I wonder what it would be like if we each wrote one of these. Because it would be like a very different story.
Yeah, and that's very true.
Yeah.
I know that if I and my sisters each did this,
Right.
you wouldn't recognize the same
Right.
parents.
Yeah.
I hear you've got some very interesting life stories, like your car sliding under a semi, and what was the other one? Survived a train wreck?
How many people do you know survived a train wreck?
Right. Well, yeah. I wonder if you could write a biography just based on disasters you've lived through. Yeah. Well, I can just tell those two stories on the theme of stories from the past. I was out the same sister who had read this. I was going to work with her. She lives in Madison. I was going to do some work with her, and it was April, maybe 20 years ago. Thought winter was over. Got on the freeway, and between here and Madison, ran into a blizzard, and was in the right lane in what was suddenly just whiteout conditions. I'm in the right lane going like 30 miles an hour, and the trucks in the next lane are just zoom, going by at 70. I started fishtailing and spun all the way around, and I could tell I was going to go under the semi.
Oh, my.
And you know how you hear that your life flashes before your eyes? Mine did, and as I'm going around there, I was interested to learn that my response to seeing my life was, that could easily have been my last thought. So, that was cool. And it just gouged a hole right out of the entire front of the car, right in front of the driver's seat. Because the back tire of the semi just hit me and spun me into the ditch.
Okay, so the truck hit you. You didn't actually go under.
No, I was under it.
Okay.
And it
I was
rolled over
imagining
me.
The truck rolled over you.
The semi, the back tire hit me and took a gouge out of the car, like the engine, and spun me into the ditch. So it was like the airbag blew and stuff. So it was probably about as close to buying it as I've ever gotten.
I would think so.
Yeah.
You can't get much closer than that. I was imagining the car literally went under the semi and came out on the other side.
Oh, no, I didn't drive all the way through because I was going 30 and it was going 70.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And what about the train wreck?
That was even earlier. That was, probably the early 80s. My girlfriend at the time were going out west to see my brother, and we treated ourselves to one of those small sleeper cars, that's at the back of the train. And suddenly the train was just jerking all over, and then it stopped. And we got out, and the entire train up to our car was on its side.
Wow.
It hit a gravel truck and derailed. And this is in western Montana, where the sky's so big and everything was completely quiet, and the bleeding porters are walking around with blankets trying to comfort people, and it was just so weird. And then they bussed us back to Williston, North Dakota, put us in a hotel. And, you're kind of in shock. I didn't realize until I saw it on CNN that I'd been in a disaster.
Oh, wow.
It's like,
we had
I'm in one of those stories.
a major earthquake in Seattle like that, and we called my parents and said, we're alive, we're okay. And they're like, that's nice, what happened? So, unfortunately, it's time to wrap it up.
Yes.
Where can people find you online?
Well, let's just stick for now with treatiescenters.org.
Okay.
We're adding a little contact page to that, so eventually.
Great. Treatiescenters.org. And Michael, where can people find you?
aperfectpint.net.
And I am at bluebellschronicles.com and gabrielshorn.com, and together we are at...
We are at booksandbrews.net, or on Instagram as Brews.
BOOKN BREWS.
Yes.
Okay, we got it. I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, always under my name, Laura Vosica. Do you have any upcoming events? You do some talks?
Going to be at Anoka Ramsey Community College in March. Might be doing something at the U in February.
Is there somewhere online people can find that information if they want to attend? Or we can put it on the site?
I'll put it on the site.
I'll inform you. That'd be
It
great.
will be on the site with the...
Michael, what do you have coming up?
No public events, as always.
Well, I'm very busy this month. I am about to call somebody to do another Scotland in the Eyes of the Author presentation for a senior center, which is a lot of fun. I bring all the weapons and instruments. I dress in a medieval gown. So anybody who would like that presentation, shameless plug. I'm just starting work on our next Gabriel Soren poetry anthology, Startled by Nature. So we're accepting submissions if you would like to submit your poetry for paying market. And the release of Loretta and Michael Kehoe's Dream of Dragons is coming up from Gabriel's Horn, too, as soon as I finish the work on that. So our next guest coming up is Douglas Van Dyke. Douglas was born in 1971. He lived many different places growing up, courtesy of the U.S. Army, and it seems to me like we've got a theme. It seems like a lot of the writers we've talked to have been in the military, or their parents, I should say. Too quiet and too shy for too long, there were always dreams of other worlds and places and the desire to write about them. His current focus is on the fantasy world of, I can't pronounce this, Dialoral. Perhaps he'll pronounce it correctly next week, which translates as Hero's Table, which was the setting for a homemade role-playing campaign. It is a land rich in heroes, magic, legends, and ambitious gods who plot to circumvent the restrictions placed upon them by a covenant. I've been a reader of fantasy since I was young, says Douglas, and Dialoral was created due to the plot holes and other trouble I had with the way some fantasy stories were written. So we are jumping from some very deep and profound history to fantasy fiction.
All right.
Quite a change.
Quite a leap.
Yeah.
I want to be sure, again, that we thank the Yoerg Brewery for allowing us to do our first remote on-site recording. The Yoerg Brewery Saloon is located at 378 Maria Avenue in St. Paul. Come and check it out. It's a beautiful old site.
It's beautiful. I fully intend to come back here just to enjoy the atmosphere here.
And I'm looking forward to tasting all of their beers once we finish recording.
We were promised. So you'll be walking home, will you?
Maybe an Uber. I don't know.
It's a long walk. All right. Thanks for being here.
Thanks very much.
This has been episode, 9 of Books and
And
Brews.
if we count all the previous ones, this is actually 19. I think we figured out we did 10
Yes.
elsewhere.
Thank you all for listening, and check us out again next month.